My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we'd like to start today with some in other true crime news, which it occurs to me we haven't done for quite a while.
I think you're right. We haven't done it in a while. Welcome to Mind Over Murder, everybody. Let's get right into it.
We're going to launch right into it, covering the local for me, not local for Bill, but local for me case. Very sad one of missing 4-year-old boy Cody Bigsby. Probably you've noticed that we have been posting updates on our Mind Over Murder social media pages and our Colonial Parkway Murder pages. We have not posted anything on that recently because sadly, there has been no new updates in this case. We are currently 3 weeks from the time that Cody Bigsby was reported missing, and the 4-year-old's whereabouts are still completely unknown to law enforcement. Every day, Bill, I go to Google and I type in Cody Bigsby updates, and sadly, there is nothing. And I just hate hearing that. The community is searching very hard for Cody, but there is just nothing coming out of this search, unfortunately.
There have been some problems in the case. One of the lead detectives was disciplined and replaced on the Cody Bigsby case. It is a multi-jurisdictional, very much a team effort, up to and including the FBI out of the Newport News office, including agents that we know who are working this case. Very sad. And of course, the fact that 3 weeks have gone by is not an optimistic sign.
Not at all. And it does bear some strong resemblances to the Noah Tomlin case from 2019, another case that we followed very closely and which ultimately, of course, had a very unhappy ending. When Noah Tomlin was found in the steam plant and his mother did recently plead guilty to his murder. Definitely some similarities to the Noah Tomlin case. We're hoping for a great outcome for Cody, but of course, as the weeks go by, I think we can unfortunately not hope for that. But at least some answers for the family would be very good. So we will continue to follow that case and post updates from our local news agencies as they become available.
In another case, there has been a significant development. It was just announced over the last couple of days that a missing teenage boy, Timothy Mangum, his remains have been identified. A skull was found in 1990 up in Stafford County, and it has remained unidentified for all of these years. DNA tests were conducted at the time they found the skull. It was found in a farmer's field alongside a fence when he was doing some weed whacking. The thinking at the time was that this was likely a suspicious death, but they didn't even know who this poor person was. It looked like the skull had been there for several years. At the time, they estimated that the person was between 15 and 18 years old and was a Caucasian male, which ended up being accurate. Although DNA testing was done at the time, ultimately the case went cold. And then it's just been announced that once again, our friends at Othram, working with the Stafford County Sheriff's Department, have identified this skull as belonging to Timothy Mangum. He was a student at Lake Taylor High School in Norfolk in April 1983, and he had been a student at the Chesapeake Public School System as recently as a couple of months before that. What seems odd to us is that he was never declared a missing person, which seems extremely odd. We hope to learn more about this case in the coming days. Our friends at Othram were able to help identify these remains as belonging to Timothy Mangum, and then hopefully now they'll be able to work this case back to try to determine what happened to this young man. It still remains a suspicious death. I think all of us would like to find out why this young man was never declared missing.
Absolutely. Kudos to David and the team over at Othram. They've done it again, folks. We cannot applaud them enough for the excellent work that they did on this case and others. Thank you to David and everybody over at Othram. You guys are doing astounding work.
I was talking to David Middleman at Othram, the CEO. David mentioned that they've added a new feature at DNAsolves.com, which I've just signed up for. You can always go to DNAsolves.com to check on what the status is on the many different cases they're working on throughout North America. But they've added a new feature where you can sign up for an email list and get advance word on case solves and developments in the various cases they're working around the country in the U.S. and Canada. You can go to DNAsolves.com, and there's an option to sign up for their email list. They won't spam you with anything else, just case developments. I just signed up for it and got my first email. So if you're interested in following what's going on with Othram Labs, that's a great way to do it.
Sounds excellent. We're going to go ahead and do something that we have not done for quite a while, which is give a case update on the Colonial Parkway murders. What we're going to do today is the same format that has been so successful for us in the past, which is I'm going to act as the MC here and feed questions to my podcast partner, Mr. Bill Thomas, the expert on all things Colonial Parkway murders.
You can listen to me shift uncomfortably in my seat.
And we're going to get to as many of these as possible. We did post these questions up on the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page and the Mind Over Murder Facebook page. And y'all delivered. You have given us quite a crop of questions about case updates. And so we're just going to get through as many as we can in one episode. We'll get through it.
Both of us were noting the other day that it's been about a year since the Lover's Lane Murders television show ran on Oxygen. You can still watch the 4 episodes covering the Colonial Parkway murders on oxygen.com and various websites. A lot of our followers have been asking us for updates on what's going on with the case. And as you'll see with the questions that Kristin has put forward, we want to try to address these in a way that's meaningful for all of you.
We do want to acknowledge that we do have plenty of newbies joining our social media pages on the regular. So we do want to make sure that everybody who is unfamiliar with the case ends up coming up to speed on where we are currently. So that is also a function of today's episode. So we'll go ahead and start. The first question actually dovetails very nicely with your introduction there, Bill. This question is from Michael Lawson, who says, it's been more than a year since the Lover's Lane murders aired. Did the show help to generate any new leads? Great question, Michael.
The short answer, Michael, is yes. We can't go into everything that has come forward, but we have had a significant number of follow-ups and questions, which was part of the point of doing the television series with Oxygen, was to shine that media spotlight on the case. I don't know that we can get into too much depth, but some very interesting information has come forward, and it is extremely helpful. And we have a new top case agent who's handling the case now for about a year. And in speaking with him recently, he said he actually thinks the media coverage, the television series, this podcast, our social media, the interviews that we do, all of that, he actually thinks has been very positive and very helpful. And it's actually good to hear that. We've fed a lot of information into the FBI and the Virginia State Police. And obviously, if one of those tips gets some traction, you'll be the first to know about it.
The next question comes from Gary Shiflett. And Gary says, I do have a very basic question. I have read several times that investigators have recovered DNA from at least one crime scene. If so, has that DNA been tested, and what did they learn from it?
That's a little bit of a nuanced question. It's a great question, Gary, and it's one that we struggle with frequently, both behind the scenes and on this podcast. The families of the Colonial Parkway Murders victims have been told at different times that there is potential perpetrator DNA. I know I sound like a lawyer when I talk, and I'm not actually an attorney. The families have been told that there is potential perpetrator DNA in 3 of the 4 crime scenes in the Colonial Parkway Murders. Those would include Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, which is the first incident in the Colonial Parkway Murders. Robin Edwards and David Knobling, the second incident in the Colonial Parkway Murders. And the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Sandy Haley, the third incident. So far, it appears that we do not have DNA evidence in the fourth incident, the murder of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer, which is the fourth double homicide in the Colonial Parkway murders. You have to keep in mind, though, that because we have DNA, it doesn't mean that DNA is in great shape. We're dealing with a lot of challenges here. We're dealing with 30-plus-year-old DNA samples, potential cross-contamination because of perhaps other people's DNA blending with those DNA samples. Keep in mind, crime scenes were not secured in the same way from 1986 to 1989, the era of the Colonial Parkway murders, like they would be in 2022. Further, we have evidence that's been tested within the limits of the technology as far back as 1986. And then, of course, when DNA makes its appearance in the early 90s in terms of forensic applications for law enforcement, some of those tests would have consumed that DNA. So at the end of the process, you may or may not have a DNA profile, and you also may not have any DNA left from the amount of DNA that you have dedicated to that test. So keep in mind, some of these tests actually consume the DNA. We've been pushing law enforcement behind the scenes, and this is both the FBI and the Virginia State Police, to conduct additional forensic testing with the available DNA. But those challenges remain. Small amounts of DNA left, some of them badly deteriorated, some of them perhaps cross-contaminated with other organic substances, which might have nothing to do with the crime whatsoever, but could have to do with water or other organic substances being mixed in with the DNA. The Robin Edwards, David Knobling homicide is a good example. Robin and David, it appears that their bodies spent 3 days in the water after they were shot and their bodies were dumped into the James River. That's not going to leave the DNA from those bodies in great shape to start with. Plus now the passage of time and all of the other things that we've talked about. So there is DNA. It's not in great shape. The challenges are significant. We're not trying to take anything away from the dedication of the agencies involved, the lab techs, and everyone who's made significant efforts to try to extract usable DNA profiles from those individuals and those crime scenes. We have asked the question recently, again, if any of the DNA found so far from any of the 4 double homicides in the Colonial Parkway murders cross-references, and the answer is still no, which is interesting. So there's nothing in the forensics still in 2022 that links these 4 incidents in the Colonial Parkway murders. I hope that's a satisfying answer. It's not the most satisfying thing for me to report, and I've talked to the other families about this many times, including in the last few weeks. And we've certainly talked with the FBI. We're overdue for a conversation with the Virginia State Police, but we'll be trying to move that conversation forward in the next few weeks.
And DNA is the most pressing question that we get on our social media pages, hands down. So we know that it is extremely frustrating for everyone out there to hear that there is DNA and that it has not been tested to what I think the satisfaction level is for everybody. And that includes family. That includes people who have followed this case for a long time.
If I can add something too, this has been a topic of considerable heat between family members and law enforcement. We have pushed hard on this. We've also tried to address an issue which has become very problematic for us, which is that the FBI Quantico lab, who do outstanding work, but they are so maxed out that getting test results back from them has proved to be an incredibly long, drawn-out process. So we've been pushing the FBI in particular to use outside labs to speed up the turnaround time, because you're going to try something and then the investigators are going to work with those results and then try something else and then work with those results. And you're not going to test everything all at once. You're going to try your most likely and then work your way down into the less likely potential sources of DNA. With the long delays at FBI Quantico, we have asked the FBI to shift to using outside labs, which they have done, and we're very appreciative of that fact. These outside labs, some of the best labs in the country, are conducting tests on behalf of the FBI in an effort to speed up that process. We're hopeful. We've got items that are currently being tested that we hope to have results sometime in the next couple of months, which is a lot better than the kind of turnaround time we had been experiencing.
And along with the conversation about do we have DNA and when is it going to be tested, there always is the question that comes up, and I saw it a couple of times here in this list of questions, is what is the delay and is there some sort of conspiracy afoot here? So let me go ahead and just read you this one. This comes from Dewey Ray, who just asked straight out, what is the delay in testing the DNA? And you really already spoke to that a little bit here. At least part of the delay is that the FBI lab is overloaded.
It is. And Dewey, I understand your frustration. Believe me, the families, we all feel the same way. We don't think there's a conspiracy here. What we're up against is the fact that this is a 31 to 35-year-old cold case with old evidence, as we were just discussing. And we've also run into budget issues, believe it or not. And it's hard for me to hear this, but I've had discussions with the Federal Bureau of Investigation about these delays, and they've said money is a problem. Particularly now we're shifting some of these tests to outside labs who charge for their services. We ended up having a good conversation, but not without heat, where I said the families could raise the funds to cover the costs if it meant that we might get more results in a timely fashion. And then the response is, well, the federal government cannot accept gifts of that type. I said, now you're painting us into a corner here. You're saying that the FBI's budget is tight and that going to these outside labs to get around the backlog at Quantico is expensive, which we understand. We're not sure we have the money for that. But when we offer to pay for it, that we're told that the families can't fundraise. It's a very frustrating kind of catch-22 hamster wheel sort of thing where we're going round and round about this. Now, I haven't given up on this, and the other families I know feel the same way because we do compare notes on this stuff frequently. We're not exactly where we need to be. And one of the things we want to explore is, could we route some of this testing through the Virginia State Police, who may be able to accept gifts of this type? I'm putting air quotes around that. The Colonial Parkway Murders families are not made of money. We have had some success, particularly the Call and Haley families in Virginia have had some success raising funds over the years. And I certainly am comfortable returning to using those techniques and asking the public for their assistance. I know people on our social media pages have asked us about this. What can we do to help? Can we make financial contributions and so on? Right now, we're not seeking that kind of support, but we may revisit this as time moves forward.
Now, there is a question that one of our loyal Mind Over Murder listeners put forth that I think is interesting, just a thought experiment here, because, of course, we are not doing what this question posits, but I will go ahead and throw that out there anyway.
Who's the questioner?
Well, so this is from Robert Gray.
And very smart guy who asks really good questions. Let's see what he hits us with today.
Yes, very much. So the first thing that he asks as part of this question is whether there is an update on where the evidence testing stands, which we have answered. And he asks, are there any legal avenues the victims' families can pursue to petition that the evidence be tested by a third-party lab like Othram? And I think David Middleman would very much appreciate that you mentioned Othram in your question. Robert, thank you.
It's a real good question.
It's a good question, yeah.
We haven't formally petitioned in the manner that you described, Robert, and it is a really great question. We have discussed it at some length, particularly with the FBI. They are much more open to using outside labs than they ever have been before. And I've also said I hope politely. I'm not. Sometimes I think my inner Irishman kicks in, and I'm a little more blunt than I should be, or that my mother would be proud of me for. But we've indicated to them that the delays that we're seeing at FBI Quantico are not acceptable, and that we've been waiting in line for 35 years. Insert your favorite profanity in any way you like.
Yeah.
I said the conversations sometimes get heated. I will say this, the FBI team has been responsive, and they have taken evidence and had it tested by outside labs, including Bodie and other top labs around the country, some of the best DNA labs in the country and in the world. So we do appreciate that. We're definitely looking to figure out ways around the backlog in Quantico, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to move that testing forward in a timely fashion. We haven't petitioned from a legal perspective or anything like that. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. I've talked to many other family members and other unsolved murders. You have to remember, the families don't actually drive this agenda. Law enforcement, whatever the responsible agency is for a particular area, they're the folks that have jurisdiction. That's the word you always hear. They have jurisdiction over this case. And so they're in control. They have the evidence. If I had the evidence, or if the families had the evidence, we would have proceeded in a different fashion, but we don't. So we have to work with our law enforcement partners. We try to keep the headbutting to a minimum. I'm not always as successful as I should be, but I pledge to try to keep my temper under control and focus on the need to work together to solve issues and find ways to get evidence tested. I hope that's a good answer, Robert. That's the best one we've got at the moment.
But are there times when Bill and I get on the phone with each other off mic and talk about how frustrated we are and how satisfying it would be to come up to some legal recourse for what has felt like a very long time and considerable foot dragging about this? Yes, we have that conversation. We had it earlier this week. We'll probably have it next week too. It is extraordinarily frustrating, but they do seem like they are moving incrementally forward. So we just have to hang on and hope that something changes. Here's actually another one. Since we're on a set of questions here from Robert, we'll go ahead and knock out the rest of them.
He's got more. Okay.
Yes, he sent us several. So we're actually going to switch over to Kathy and Becky's case, which of course you are the reigning expert on. This is a really good one, and I don't think I've seen this asked before. Robert asks, did law enforcement or private investigators ever grid search the now closed Ringfield Plantation picnic area for a potential perpetrator weapon in the Thomas Dowski case?
I wasn't there, but I've talked to the FBI about it on numerous occasions. I believe a thorough and professional search was done of the Ringfield Plantation picnic area, which is an area along the Colonial Parkway, about 9/10 of a mile away from the Cheatham Annex Overlook, where my sister Kathy's 1980 Honda Civic was found with the bodies of Kathy and Becky inside. A number of investigators have commented to me that they thought it was quite possible that the Ringfield Plantation picnic area, which has been closed for many years, which has significantly more privacy than the very shallow Cheatham Annex Overlook along the river, which by my count, it's only about 50 feet from the surface of the road to the part of the embankment that rolls down towards the York River, where Kathy's car was found, just out of sight. It doesn't afford much privacy there. There was a line of thinking among a number of investigators who handled this case that they thought Ringfield Plantation was a likely location if a couple like Kathy and Becky wanted to be alone, listen to music, be romantic, whatever. As I understand it, a thorough search was conducted there. It's a very large area.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a fence where the Naval Weapons Station and Cheetah Annex are separated from the picnic area.
Yes.
And you can see Navy ships in the distance loading explosives and even serious weaponry up to and including nuclear weapons at that site. There is a security fence along the perimeter of the picnic area. It's quite large, and they don't know exactly where Kathy and Becky were. They don't even know for sure if they were at the Ringfield Plantation location. They are pretty certain that Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were not killed at the Cheetah Annex Overlook where Kathy's car was found. I think I'm giving a longer answer than you might have been looking for, but my sense is a significant search was conducted. I've heard about FBI agents, other law enforcement agencies, and even some recruits, if I'm not mistaken, fanning out and doing a search where they were walking 6 feet apart or whatever. And I'm sure they used metal detectors and other things. Remember, with Kathy and Becky, there's a very strong potential that a knife was used. And so they might have been looking for something along those lines. To my knowledge, nothing was ever found there.
And did a certain overzealous podcaster who lives in the area also go tramping around Ringfield Plantation to go look for things of that nature? No, never.
I have no idea what podcasting team you could be referring to.
No, she would never, ever do that.
And take pictures and
video.
Record video.
She would never.
I can't see that happening. I really can't.
No, never.
Even a couple of years ago, I couldn't see this happening. Could you?
Nope. No, not at all.
Seems preposterous.
Yeah, it's never happened. Ever. Here's another one from Robert. Has it ever been a theory that perpetrators in the Thomas Dowski case traveled by boat on Felgates Creek or the York River rather than by car to and from the crime scene if it was indeed the Ringfield Plantation picnic area and where the car was found? Somebody knows his geography.
Yeah, he does.
Good job.
It's not one of my theories, but there is a discussion group online that I participate in. I try to check in from time to time that is referred to as the EAR GSK Pro Boards. EAR stands for East Area Rapist. Mm-hmm. GSK, of course, stands for Golden State Killer. Remember, before the Golden State Killer was called the Golden State Killer, that case was referred to as the East Area Rapist case because they didn't realize that the East Area Rapist in California had escalated to murder and then ultimately was identified as Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer.
And for a while, it was EARONS.
Right.
For East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker. And that was so unwieldy.
And that's actually why Michelle McNamara, may she rest in peace, came up with the title of Golden State Killer because she thought the East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker nomenclature was just so awkward. Mm-hmm. So this Pro Board, which is a discussion group you sign up for, and all are welcome to sign up if you go to EAR GSK or search for EAR GSK Pro Boards in Google, you'll be taken there. And you can read discussions. There are a number of people on that Pro Board, including people that I know personally, that are actively discussing the Colonial Parkway murders. So there are special sections within, very clearly marked. If you want to go to the discussion group for the Colonial Parkway murders, you can go there and you can chime in and add your thoughts and ask questions there. I typically will go there to answer questions, not dissimilar to what we're doing here, except I'm typing them out. I know a lot of the people on the Pro Boards, and there's a woman, I know her real name, but she goes by Cleopatra on the site because some people will use a nom de plume. Cleo is actually very enamored of the theory that a person involved in the Colonial Parkway murders could move around very easily using the water, the York River, the James River. And Cleo would smile to hear you ask that question. I'm not a big fan of the movement by water theory, but man, Cleo, who's a really smart person and an outstanding researcher, she's always coming up with new information and tossing out some very interesting ideas and a lot of very well-researched information into that group for discussion. She loves the boat idea, and she talks about it quite frequently. And I'm not there to argue with her about it. I'm just not a huge fan of the Colonial Parkway Murders perpetrators or perpetrator using a boat.
This next question comes from Julie Chalker, another one of our loyal listeners who also leaves us wonderful questions.
Hey, Julie.
Thank you, Julie. So Julie says, I've recently been mulling over the logistics of the Thomas Dowski murder. If these young women were not attacked where the car was found, how did the perpetrator get back to his vehicle to leave? 2 individuals involved.
Julie, it's a fantastic question. It's something I've thought about quite a bit, and I know our investigators have thought about this a lot and discussed it with me and others. There seem to be 2 schools of thought. One of the signatures in the Colonial Parkway murders seems to be the movement of cars or vehicles post-mortem. So it feels like in a lot of these examples that killings have taken place and then cars are moved. Now, in every example, I think except the first one, Kathy and Becky, the cars are moved, I think, without the bodies. And they seem to be staged to create certain impression. The feeling is that the killer or killers seem to be maybe even moving things around inside the car or placing things in ways that investigators will find later, like the objects inside Keith Call's Toyota Celica, for example. There are beer cans and other items that seem to be placed in ways that are designed to create certain impressions. Or the roach clip at incident number 4, the Phelps Lauer murder on Interstate 64. Daniel Lauer's 1972 Chevrolet Nova is found parked in the acceleration lane of the rest stop, and it has a roach clip with a feather on it outside the window. And some people in law enforcement took that as a taunt. Back to your question, Julie, about the logistics, which the investigators have talked a lot about. There seem to be 2 schools of thought. One is one perpetrator, and he moves the victim's car and then jogs or runs or walks back to his vehicle. For example, in the situation we just described with the Ringfield plantation along the Colonial Parkway, and Kathy's Honda being found at the Cheetah Mannix Overlook, which is about 9/10 of a mile. He could walk that in 15 minutes, give or take.
Yeah.
And jog it in probably half that. Kristin's the runner here. So how long do you think it would take you to run 9/10 of a mile if your adrenaline was flowing?
You could probably do it in 5 minutes. And honestly, Ringfield is, if I were to park at the Cheetah Mannix Overlook, which I have done, and try to make it over to the Ringfield plantation site, I could jog it in about 5 minutes, and I could walk it in 7 or 8, probably.
At a good clip, walking.
At a good steady
fast
clip.
Walk, right. So there's a situation, Julie, where someone might be able to park their car, let's say at Ringfield Plantation, commit an act of murder, then move Kathy and Becky's car, my sister's car, to the Cheetah Mannix Overlook, and then run or jog back to where he'd left his car. Then the second method is if there's an accomplice. And of course, then things get a little bit simpler in that, let's just say you have 2 people, likely men, in a car or vehicle, and they've committed a murder. One of them drives the victim's car. For example, I'll just go with another case, Keith Call and Cassandra Haley. Keith's car is found along the Colonial Parkway. They're never found. It might be possible for 2 people. One of them drives the Toyota. The other one drives their vehicle, their original vehicle, whatever that might be. And then they drop the Toyota off. And you can, just insert the other vehicles in this scenario. They drive away then in their original vehicle. But that involves 2 people. For the longest time, I thought that 2 people made the most sense. However, our FBI investigators, in walking me through and actually taking me to some of these crime scenes, we're talking about people with a great deal of expertise, far more than I would ever have. I'm not an investigator. They walked me through the logistics of what might be involved in having a single person move cars around in a way that would allow a single killer to actually move the vehicle. In incident number 4, the Phelps Lauer murder, which they believe may have started on one side of Interstate 64, then perhaps the victims are taken in their own car to the Hunt Club, one exit further east. I always get this confused.
East. Yep.
One exit further east along Interstate 64. They're taken to the Hunt Club, which is within a half mile, I would say, off the highway. They're killed there, left there under the blanket, which came from the Chevy Nova, we know. Then he drives the Chevy Nova back westbound on Interstate 64, parks it in the wrong rest stop. This has always been the thing that people struggle with, is that why isn't the car left in the direction of travel towards Virginia Beach from Amelia County instead of appearing to head back there? A killer could then park the car, run across the median strip, which has trees, and probably just very quickly run across 2 lanes of traffic, wait in the trees for a moment to make sure no cars are coming. And once there's a gap in traffic, run the rest of the way across the other 2 lanes of traffic, get back in his car and drive away. My thinking was altered actually by working with these law enforcement agents and listening to them carefully. And they're very smart and they've really thought a lot about this. It's possible one person could move most of these vehicles around by himself. And then, of course, the second scenario involves them having an accomplice and a second driver. And so they move the car, then hop back in their original vehicle and drive away.
And then we've got one second question from Julie here. And this is definitely something that we've covered before, but I think it bears going into again. Julie asks, before and after the crimes, were there any reports of harassment or suspicious activity at any of the known crime scenes? And I think definitely getting into the reputation that the Parkway had at that time period is probably a pretty good place to start here. You want to jump in on that?
Julie, thanks for the question. It's a really good one. The short answer is absolutely yes. And this is something that law enforcement has spent a significant amount of time looking into. All of these places where these events took place, or at least where the cars were found, we are not 100% clear on exactly where these murders have taken place. All we know is we end up with vehicles found in most of these examples initially and then bodies afterwards. Almost all of the sites have a reputation for being lovers lane locations and also sometimes places where people would go to do low-level drug deals. So this would be a place you would go to score some pot. And we always have to remember, and I'm always reminding college audiences and younger people, this is before cell phones and before the internet. So you weren't carrying your smartphone in your pocket and you weren't texting somebody or calling somebody saying, hey, can we get together? Obviously, I don't know what people do now, but back in the day, if you wanted to, let's say, buy some pot, you went to the place where the pot dealers hung out. And especially on weekend nights, you would probably run into somebody who would size you up and then mumble something about whether or not you wanted to buy drugs. That's how it worked. Unless you called your dealer at home or at work, those are the only places people had phones. It was all landlines, and there were no other ways to really communicate. I think it's a little further along where drug dealers are among the first people to get beepers.
Yep.
And you can see this.
Doctors and drug dealers.
Yeah, exactly. And beep them, and you could send them, in some cases, a short message. Law enforcement did look very hard at these sites to see what else had taken place there. It's also worth throwing into the mix that the Ringfield Plantation site on the Colonial Parkway and the Ragged Island Wildlife Management Area both had reputations for a lot of gay cruising. So gay men would go to these sites for quick anonymous sex. Those reputations for sexual assignations, gay and straight, were part of the mix here in terms of what law enforcement was looking for. So they were looking for things along those lines. They were also looking for police impersonators because that was very much something that was part of the mix right from the very beginning of the Colonial Parkway murders, even before the other murders had taken place. Some people have heard me say this before. 3 days after Kathy and Becky were murdered, we were told by 2 FBI agents at my parents' dining room table that they thought that my sister and Ms. Dowski had been approached by an authority figure. And I asked the 2 FBI agents from the Boston office, what's an authority figure? And I said, we're sorry, we're confused. We don't understand. When you say an authority figure, what's an authority figure? And they hemmed and hawed, which was very striking to me because most FBI agents that I've met are pretty polished and seem to have a good answer for almost everything. It was very clear they were uncomfortable with the answer they gave, which was, we believe that your sister and Ms. Dowski were approached by an authority figure. What they meant was law enforcement or someone presenting as such. That's a direct quote. So that could be a police impersonator, someone with lights on their dashboard or up in the grill of their car, and they pull in and a couple is, let's say, pulled over engaging in romantic behavior or smoking some pot or whatever it is that kids do. They were doing young people stuff, maybe not paying that much attention to their surroundings. That was also some of what they were looking for. So I know that law enforcement spent a great deal of time looking for any kind of record for any of the kind of behaviors that I've mentioned over the last minute or two, up to and including police impersonations.
We have so many questions that we are not going to be able to get to all of our listener questions today. So we are going to wrap this episode of Case Update for the Colonial Parkway Murders, and we will continue with our listener questions next week. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.